and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Before we begin, a quick note. It's been a few months since the last episode. I had to step back for family reasons, and I just wanted everyone to know that I really appreciate their patience. Thanks for sticking around. And as you heard in the intro, the podcast formerly known as Bad Canadians will be continuing forward now as The Canadians. New name, same spirit. I'm also happy to say there's now a way to support the show, if you'd like to. I've set up a Buy Me a Coffee page, and I'll leave the link in all the relevant places. I can't think of a better way to kick off this new era than with one of Canada's true intellectual heavyweights, David Cayley. David Cayley spent more than 30 years as a producer for the CBC radio program Ideas, where he created hundreds of documentaries on history, philosophy, politics, religion, and culture. He is also the author of several books, including his latest, The CBC, a book reflecting on the corporation itself and the question of what a public broadcaster should be in a fractured and distrustful age. It's not unusual today to hear criticism of the CBC. What makes Cayley's critique different is that it doesn't end in cynicism or a call to tear it all down. He's trying to think seriously about whether a public broadcaster could still serve a real purpose in this country, and if so, what principles might guide it forward. In this conversation, we spend time on his diagnosis of what has gone wrong, but even more time on his constructive vision. We talk about the fact that we cannot simply recreate the past, that the old world is not coming back, and that any path forward has to reckon honestly with the novel situation we are now in. What emerges is a thoughtful discussion, not just about the CBC, but about institutions, public life, thinking itself, and what renewal might actually require. If you want to explore more of David Cayley's work, I strongly recommend visiting his website. It is a remarkable archive of articles, books, and documentaries collected over many years. I'll link it in the show notes. And without further ado, David Cayley. Wow, Mr. David Cayley, welcome to The Canadians.
Thank you.
It's a very pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you for coming on.
Glad to be here.
And first off, as a lifelong CBC consumer, listener, I just want to say thank you. I'm sure I came across CBC Ideas is one of the greatest shows ever. So I'm sure I've consumed a lot of your work without realizing it. So yeah, just a real heartfelt thank you for all that contribution over the years.
You're welcome.
And you're not done yet. This book, I've been, I still wake up every morning and I go to the CBC and I read my provincial, national, international news there before I move on to other sources. So I've been waiting for this book about the CBC for years because, like you, I'm sure you have I still have a deep love for the CBC as a Canadian institution, but I share many of your concerns about where it's at today. And so maybe just, you wrote a beautiful book. I thought I would know what the book was going to be, but took a very different approach than I was expecting. I think maybe a much deeper approach. It goes back and starts off in the 60s when you start diagnosing the issues. And I was really surprised pleasantly by the second half of the book, just kind of the constructive vision you have going forward. And you very openly admit you don't have a full roadmap, but you kind of suggest some principles or ideas we might want to incorporate into the path forward. So I'd really love to leave, maybe a bit more time to even just talk about the second half and the first half. But maybe just to get the ball rolling here, we can just ask you, as someone who's worked at the CBC over 30 years, what are your concerns with the modern CBC right now?
Well, it's hard to answer that in general. What I've done in the book is separate the life of the CBC into three eras. I was influenced by a predecessor of mine, an old producer who I knew and loved called Eric Koch, who wrote a history in the 1980s of a television program called This Hour Has 7 Days, which was a cause célèbre in the 1960s in Canada. It was broadcast for 2 years. It scandalized the old Ottawa management, who are all radio veterans, trying to tame this new beast, television, and was run by bright younger people who had a whole vision of what they could do with television. And it was a major collision. It created a virtual civil war within the corporation and was eventually canceled. But in fact, 7 Days won the war because it set the tone for a whole new era. So that's the first division. The first era, from the creation of the CBC in 1932 and then again in 1936, was fairly staid by today's standards. It stood back a little bit. It had its main concern growing up was to keep the government out of its affairs. So the struggle for its political independence was a major chapter in the life of the CBC, and it cultivated, let's say, a studied neutrality, right? And so when a new program came along that this hour has 7 days, and which staked its whole legitimacy on its audience, not on its own decorum, but on that it was with the audience. That initiated what I think of as a new era and call the populist era. The question is, the term isn't quite right, because what people now call populism, maybe is Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
Or perhaps Pierre Poilievre is also called a populist, but it's sort of as a right-wing phenomenon, a demagogic phenomenon. What I mean, and how the word was used at the CBC, was in contrast to elitism. That was the great binary in the 60s, was populism versus elitism. So elitism meant that you, in effect, had your own standards, right? You were bringing something to the people. You were bringing education or whatever it was to the people. Populism meant, no, you were from the people. You were taking your standards from your audience. And my argument, very briefly, because you'll need to get a word in twice here, is that era has now ended. Maybe we can talk about that more.
And what has replaced that era?
Well, we don't know that because it's still ending, right? That is still the dominant ethos. If you had people with memories long enough at the corporation, which is ceasing now, really. This would have been true 10 to 20 years ago. They would have said that 7 days was the beginning of a new era, right? The radio revolution, the programs that are still on the air today, as it happens, and so on, right? Those shows set a new tone. And we're still very much in that, but my claim in brief is that the shattering of the audience, under the influence both of new media and of moral conflict, has left that populist position stranded and in effect turned it into a new elitism. Because the CBC now belongs to an audience which is by no means all of Canada. They belong to and identify with and find their legitimacy as standing for that segment. And I think they're in a way in a cul-de-sac. I used the word stranded a moment before.
Right. And what's the moral complexity that you mentioned a moment ago?
Well, I have the feeling, looking at, let's take a concrete case. One of the things that I develop in the book is the story of the Freedom Convoy. It the truckers' protest in Ottawa in the winter
Yep.
of 2022. It serves my purposes in a variety of ways. It was, first of all, in my opinion, an emergent public. It formed spontaneously from different parts of the country out of a matter of concern, a matter of moral concern. There were a large number of Canadians who felt that vaccine mandates, at least in the case of this particular vaccine, which wasn't preventing transmission of the illness and was not well studied, and certainly not studied for any lengthy period, that was a bridge too far for quite a large number of Canadians, and they made their opinions known through this instrument. You could see on the bridges, in the parking lots, as the various strands of the convoy emerged on Ottawa, that this was a representative happening. So the CBC is a public broadcaster. Yes, everyone agrees on that. This is, by my definitions, a public. So the CBC needs to speak to this public. It needs, and one of the things that a public is, by my definitions, is an emergent, undefined, or still to be defined phenomenon. So one of the roles of public broadcasting, as I understand it, would be to interrogate, to give this thing voice and shape and resistance. I mean, that's not being a mouthpiece. That's entering into a dialogue. Mm-hmm. Well, what the CBC actually did was just shocked me. The night the trucks arrived in Ottawa, they called a trucker in North Dakota who was against the protest. They never went and opened a truck door. They never talked to a single person who had made that trip. Somehow, that this thing assembled itself in the middle of a Canadian winter, and they got those big rigs all rolling towards Ottawa, whether or not they were leaning on their air horns and driving everyone crazy, which admittedly they were. Didn't seem to strike them. It didn't seem it seemed to threaten them, right? These are invaders. These are foreigners. These are not our fellow citizens. These are not the people we talk with. These are not the people we talk about. They're in the grips of resentment. They're in the grips of misinformation. They don't have any real concerns, right? They're a threatening foreign body. We're going to ignore them. And the CBC, with a few honorable exceptions, I want to acknowledge that, but not many, kept up that policy for 2 weeks. And when the Fifth Estate did a kind of summary report afterwards, they never even addressed the issue that those people said they came to Ottawa about. They treated it as a public order problem. They treated it as a security problem, right? But they never, ever allowed them the dignity of putting forward an argument, right? Putting forward a conversational proposition which needed to be discussed. No. And so that would be an example of estranging yourself from parts of the public that you find unpalatable and don't want to talk to and don't want to talk about and don't want to recognize.
It felt like that really was one of those moments that kind of entrenched a public viewpoint, especially maybe amongst the more working class people, because that movement was largely seen as a working class movement as well, because I think it involved so many people that during COVID were working in the physical world. They're tow truck drivers, long haul drivers, people that couldn't survive the pandemic on their laptops. And it seemed to really show a division along even class lines in some ways. And I felt like it did kind of, for a lot of working class people, it felt like the CBC did kind of reach that elitism level where it was they're understanding this from a professional class that could navigate this on their laptops and follow all the provisions, and there just didn't seem to be any real genuine desire to understand people that were living a different lifestyle than you and were facing different situations and different problems even during this pandemic. And I did really feel like that was one of those pivotal moments that really did entrench a sense of elitism with our public broadcaster. I did want to ask you though, because you also do talk about the public a lot, like you define what is a public. And I wanted to ask you a bit about that because there's all sorts of threads and pressures coming together in history and I, and countries themselves, I don't know a lot, are relatively newer concepts. They've, most countries have only been around 200 or 300 years.
Right.
And you can see that birth of the CBC kind of coming on the back of the railroad and, and really becoming a national voice to unify this country. And you can see at the beginning of that process how you'd want to try to kind of unify and create a national voice. But I'm wondering sometimes too, whether, what we're seeing today and how you're advocating, I think, for looking at instead of one public, many publics. And I see like with new media and technology, we're kind of being pushed into niches where it was probably easier to have a national identity or a sense of national unity when we had 3 channels,
Oh, yeah.
And but now we just have all these endless niches that people get lost on. But I also wonder if some of that is just the limits of country building. Like, do you see that at play at all? That there's only so much you can take a large geographical space that has a wide amount of people in it and try to create one national unity that eventually you're going to eventually marginalize some voices that are going to want to push back and get representation?
Well, that is certainly true, but I don't think I have anything original to say about it. I mean, Canada has had those pressures from the very beginning, right? Even joining Confederation in many places was an issue, and it's always been under stress and strain. It's an enormous country. It does not have one cohesive myth, right? It has a variety of peoples with a variety of stories, often butting heads, right? So we're, in a certain way, Northrop Frye used to say this, the literary critic, that the United States, in a way, deduced its existence from its great idea, from its Constitution. It unrolled inevitably and deductively across the continent, and they called it manifest destiny. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas Canada was made up inductively. It was more ingrown parts assembling themselves, but always it's in some ways ill-assorted. So yeah, that's all true.
Well, this is where I can just see the need. Like, maybe you could speak about how you define the public and what you're proposing for multiple publics going forward.
I would say I lived my whole life at the CBC over 40 years with this question in mind. What is the public in public broadcasting? But I was very lucky to fall in with some scholars who did a 5-year project called Making Publics. And it's been somewhat agreed behind the work of a German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, that the public emerges in the 18th century. There's no such thing as the public in the 17th century. The King of England says, these people are intermeddling in the affairs of state, like they have no those affairs are in the proper hands, right? The people who are entitled to manage them, and there's no such thing as a public with a voice. So I think everyone agrees that in the 18th century, suddenly there's something called the public opinion, right? And by the end of the 18th century, I mean, the American Constitution can be put in the voice of we the people, as if we the people had a voice. Or the public opinion, its sovereignty is acknowledged in the French Revolution, in the British House of Commons. What happened before that? that was what these people I fell in with were asking themselves in this kind of academic consortium that ran over 5 years and was immensely instructive for me. But what they basically supposed was that there were little publics that coalesced into this. It doesn't happen all at once. That madrigal singers or map makers or whatever interest people had gradually assembled them into publics. And so they had a picture of the public as dynamic, right? As forming and deforming and reforming, as provisional, right? That the matters of concern draw people together, that the boundaries are not fixed. So it's a different picture than somehow just imagining some great abstraction called the public, right? How is the public going to react to this? Well, it's not really, right? Because there's no, so the public was a powerful, useful, compelling modern myth, right?
Right.
Like science, right? Is another word like that, right? There isn't actually any such thing as science. There are
It's like a moving target.
There are many sciences which achieve different degrees of knowledge, different degrees of certainty about their subjects, which are internally divided, and so on. But people, that was another aspect of the pandemic where I was critical of the CBC for not challenging this mythology, that where people were told to follow the science at a time, when there couldn't possibly be any such thing as the science because we were dealing with a novel situation and a novel object. But even if that hadn't been the case, right, there were disagreements of every kind, some of them fundamental. So to speak about the science is just myth-making. But in this case, the public is equally a myth of that kind, right? So one needs to look and see, well, what are the publics that are involved? And I think that's the first step in a reform of the CBC, is to understand that publics are plural.
Right.
Now, in a certain sense, people understood that all along, right? A show has its audience, right? The people who listen to Quirks and Quarks aren't the same people necessarily who listen to the jazz program on Saturday night, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you already knew in a certain way that there was a segmentation of the audience, that those were different publics. Mm-hmm. But it's still a change in the dominating, in the framework, in how you think about it.
So would viewpoint diversity, like just trying to re-emphasize viewpoint diversity, would that be just something to rally around as one of the key things of a public broadcaster mandate? Well, yes, I think it would, as long as you understood that there's two sides always to the question. So I love your line, the path of all knowledge runs through the question.
Right. So there is a curatorial role. There is, and if you want to say it, an elite role to be played by the CBC in selecting and curating a conversation. It isn't just viewpoint diversity, right? So here's X and Y says the opposite, so let's put X and Y in the ring and see what happens. That's not going to be very interesting. Right. It's not going to be very enlightening. It isn't really a question of having a lot of shouting.
You want responsible curation. You want somebody who can curate.
We've had a lot of shouting on radio going back in the United States and even in Canada 30 and 40 years now with this Yeah, no, and I think it's easy to misunderstand it. I would like to pose it as a question rather than to think, well, yeah, that's just going to be people yelling at each other.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
because if you say the path of all knowledge leads through the question, which is a quote from a German philosopher called Hans Georg Gadamer, a great hero of mine. What Gadamer means is that a question opens a subject, right? So hopefully it opens it in a way that everyone who's engaged, taking part, listening, watching, whatever, sees a different aspect than they had seen before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, in a way, the art of interviewing, right? To hear what you've said, but then not to take it as finished, right? Okay, you said that, I ask you something else, you say something else, I ask you something else, you say something else. No. What did you say? What are the meaning of the words that you said? What's in what you said? Does it open? Can it be opened? And then, he speaks of, in that little quotation, he speaks of a path, right? A path opens if the
Mm-hmm.
question is pursued in a certain spirit. So yes, I do think that questioning becomes tremendously important in developing a new philosophy.
It seems that spirit of the question probably, I'm just guessing, has to be kind of more like something coming out of genuine curiosity. But it feels like we're in a time period of a lot of certainty. Like, how do we even get people wanting to ask the question again?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that the certainty is very often reactive, right? So in a time of unthinkable questions, right? So I'll just take one example. I mean, another German scholar, Ulrich Beck, wrote a book in the 1990s that had a big effect on me called Risk Society. And in this book, Beck shows that modern society is essentially a gigantic science experiment, but it not an experiment that can actually be done, right? We don't have another Earth to test with a test climate we could use to see how are we really affecting the climate, or maybe drop some atomic bombs to see how that's going to go. But that, in every respect, that is the life we live, right? We don't social media, right? A society mediated to this degree, to the point where it's common to hear people say, we used to have media outside us, which we could, there were, as you said, the free television channels, but now we, in effect, are inside media, right? A completely novel circumstance, right? However much media of communication may have shaped societies in the past, and if you belong to the sort of Enos McLuhan school, you would say to a very great extent, maybe even to a predominant extent, but never like this. Never as a comprehensive environment. So we don't know. And we can't know. And you add to that the fact that the moral fissures have just grown and grown and grown since the 1960s, right? The postulate of women's liberation based on free access to abortion has created an equal and opposite reaction. People who can't accept that, don't believe that, right? Made medical assistance in dying is now taken for granted almost in my milieu as the proper way to end your life. But to notionally the other half of the society, it's anathema. It's unthinkable. And you just can go on endlessly, finding issues on which people divide all the way down. Right?
Is this where you kind of mentioned in the book that you felt that we are at a place where we're disagreeing at first principles, where we can't even unify at first principles? Is this what you're talking about right now?
I don't see how.
And it's a moral. I'm wondering, I just finished talking to Professor Eric Kaufman in the University of Buckingham.
Yes.
And he was talking. Okay, yeah. And so, he kind of talks about the three awakenings, and there's other academics like him who take slightly different approaches that talk about these ideas coming in the 60s into academia and then kind of having a faster march in 2010 on. And how much of the populist argument, the story you're telling of the CBC, the 7 Days War, how much of that is correlating with those ideas that were floating around academia at the time?
Well, that I don't know the answer to. I think that's pretty complicated, right?
Yeah.
I can't. I find it difficult to draw any straight lines in that respect, right? Because certain. Yeah. No, I don't think I want to.
Yeah. No, that's fair, and that's good to hear, because I do often think. Myself included, maybe I hold too rigid a straight line sometimes, because things do tend to be loose and complicated and often hard to, again, that's a danger of certainty. Sometimes it's not deserved, I don't think, to have that much certainty. So yeah, I think that's a fair answer.
But I mean, I do, maybe I should say that there's a chapter in my book called, maybe a little pretentiously, Thinking. And I have said there that there are absolute barriers, and what I argue in the chapter is that thinking is what we need above all, right? That when you're in a new, unprecedented circumstance and people don't agree, you can only, thinking is the only thing you have available to you initially, to think about it, to meditate about it, to find new light on the subject. That the things that prevent thinking, in my opinion, are things like identity politics, because identity politics involves essences. It involves retrenching on an identity, right? Something that is unchallengeable, something that is singular, something that doesn't open to thought. Identity is a command. In the end, it's an unquestionable command. The loss of history would be another example of that, right? That if you begin to your history sinks under the weight of contemporary moral judgment to the extent that you really don't even have access to it. The country's first prime minister was in a box over in front of the Ontario legislature for 4 years. And he's pretty heavily guarded now, right? The city of Kingston, where John MacDonald did his thing, took his statue down, right? So that's a very heavy level of judgment, right? So you think you know everything about your history. You don't open your history to question, and you lose the source of ideas that might have been there, the possibility of thinking. And I can go on, right? So yes, I think something that people call wokeness, however many phases or waves it has, is depressing inquiry, and to that extent is anti-thinking. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I often think that with all these issues, it is easier to pull back and just look at the thinking involved without even having to get into the nuts and bolts day-to-day minutia of the whatever cultural issues blowing up in the moment. It just seems that we can actually just focus on basic thinking skills, basic communicating skills, empathy, like listening skills, and kind of avoid some of the more serious, because it seems that's where things are breaking down on a deeper level, and where I still hold hope for a public broadcaster to maybe be able to step in and fulfill a mandate more related to that. It's I wonder, like, can I just share like my own personal experience with the CBC, and maybe you could help shed some light on it.
Please.
I know it's not your role necessarily, but I found that, as a long time follower of the CBC, and maybe in the last 10, 15 years, as I watched like the word equality being removed everywhere in Canada and replaced with equity, and being told that the colorblind society ideal I was raised with and my parents were raised under and I raised my son under was actually racist, and we should be doing anti-racism, and and that we should be using the word queer instead of gay, and there's just all these places where all this, and I was waiting to, as someone who grew up on the left, I was I had some issues with some of these. I wanted to talk about this. I wasn't fully on board with all these changes, and I kept waiting for this. The CBC to me felt like the natural place where these things were going to be discussed. And by the time I realized that discussion was not going to happen, I saw that the CBC had gone all in on one side of that discussion, and it had already gotten to the point where even just trying to ask for a discussion was treated as being a hateful, bigoted person, and I felt wrong even asking the question anymore. And so, how? Maybe I'm wrong on my assessment. I'm open to that completely. But why was CBC not able to hold that discussion?
Wow. I think fear is the predominant explanation. If we go back to the convoy, they were afraid of these people. It's seen as reactionary, right? And
is it the moral fracture you're talking about?
Yes,
again?
I think so. Right. So you're at the end of a civilization in a certain way that you now see in a very dark light, right? The colonial past, the stolen continent. You can't really, you've lost the story of progress, that this somehow, whatever its injustices and its brutalities, which were many, there was still a tendency, a movement, an arc which you can affirm, right? There are things that are good in our way of life. There are things that are good about Canada. A lot of people, I think, lost that, and so it's amazing how far it's gone, right? So we flew the flags at half-mast for 6 months after ground-penetrating radar found soil anomalies at a residential school in Kamloops. Soil anomalies which have more than one plausible explanation, which doesn't involve murdered children.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
It is a pretty much a verboten subject, and I think that must have to do with fear, guilt and fear.
It does,
and having. I mean, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but and having lost the plot. Having lost the idea that there is a plot, that there's, yeah.
I can relate to that though, because I actually, I'm a curious person, and I got the book grave errors that was on the, the Kamloops case. And a few of us were passing it around between us, and we literally were putting it in a brown paper bag and quickly passing it to each other in social gatherings so nobody else around us would see it. And it felt like very verboten, like this is, and just also an indicative of where our culture is at, that we're having to hide this book that we're just wanting to read.
I mean, look what happened in Quesnel.
And what happened in Quesnel?
Well, the mayor was
sanctioned.
Sanctioned by his council because his wife distributed that book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's how it all started. You're not allowed to read that book. Yeah. That book is by deniers. Yeah. Right? They should all wear a big scarlet D.
But there's this irony of the truth and reconciliation, it's like truth and reconciliation. It's I'm not denying that terrible things were happening at the residential school system, and there's nuance to be had here, but it seems I can see why in principle people are upset that we can't have an open discussion when something is supposed to be centered around the truth. That's and so how, you also say standing back to see better is another expression you say. Did you want to speak to what you mean by that for a moment?
Well, sure. I was very influenced when I started to think about these things, which is in the 1970s, by a book by Richard Sennett, a man who's still active and still writing books, called The Fall of Public Man. And Sennett was a veteran like me of the 1960s, and he began to doubt some of the received wisdom of that era, and that, the personal is political would be a sample slogan, right? Just that we need to, that intimacy is what we're striving for, that we want to get real, right? That's another expression of the time, get real. And what Sennett explored in this book was the uses of formality. So the uses of distance in a certain way, right? That I don't get so close to you or make so many assumptions about you that I can't really see you anymore, right? And that we have to, and we're so close that we have to agree, or we're going to fall out, and there's going to be this, we've talked about the kind of atmosphere that we're living in now, right? Of antipathy, of violent reaction. So I took Sennett very seriously, and thought, and I always thought another strand that went into this is I began broadcasting, this is 1971, under the influence of a Brazilian adult educator called Paulo Freire, who wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which basically elevates dialogue to the level of a first principle. He was influenced by Martin Buber. The dialogue was in the air. So I was sitting at a microphone talking and pondering, how is this a dialogue, right? How this is a monologue. I'm the only one talking, right? And this isn't something that can be remedied by answering machines or feedback, right? It's structural. But the way in which I came to the conclusion, later making ideas programs, that I could leave my discourse in some way open to the other, open to a response. I could structure it in such a way that it invited participation, that if you like, it raised questions, not by being a shrinking violet about saying what I thought or putting my view forward, but still somehow leaving room for the other, right? But that requires a certain formality. That requires a certain distance, right? And it's in conflict or contradiction with the spirit of we-making, which is dominated to CBC increasingly, I think, in a kind of innocent, outgoing way in the 70s and into the 80s, This Country in the Morning, which became Morningside, people remember Peter Zosky, and, that was a kind of expansive period of really still nation building, if you want to call it that, right? It was in some ways a continuation of the earlier era of the CBC, right? But then it can segue into this we-making in which, it's all about us, but who's us, right?
Right.
Where's the room for the other one, the one who's not part of the us, right? And so I regard formality and dialogue and conversation as all linked themes, right? So you have to be able to stand back. If you listen, just turn on the CBC. If I went downstairs now, the afternoon show, right? I'd be hearing about what's going on my 401, what's going to happen in my weather, how's my week going. We're going to have an information package that's going to get you up to date on what's happening in your world. That's a trained style of address, right? CBC trainers make sure that their hosts know that they should use as many personal pronouns as possible.
Right.
As if, and all that generates an illusion. Certainly an illusion, right?
Yeah.
But you don't know the people who are talking on the top of your refrigerator, which is where my radio is. But they talk as if they're my intimate friends, right? They know me, I know them. We're all one thing. And I think that, so I'm trying to tell you what I meant by standing back, right? I think you have to stand back from that. You don't have to be frosty. You don't have to be stuck up, right? You don't have to be pretentious. But you do have to observe a certain distance. I don't know you yet, right? It's a question of who you think you're addressing. And if there's room in your address for others that you don't know yet and who may not agree with you, right? If your talk always is formed by the presumption of agreement, yeah, you've lost that. And I think you have to, in some way, regain it. And I don't think, facing these questions, we never know what we're talking about, right? I can look back and the style of the old CBC, I can get that. But what would be the style of a new CBC? Well, we don't know that yet, right? The question is to open ourselves a little bit to it, to see how it goes, to try talking in different ways, to try making different assumptions, and to look the present conjuncture in the eye, I think, right?
Yeah, you're pretty open in the book that you think there's no going back in any capacity, that we can't recapture the past in any of that. We have to be willing to be open to a new path forward.
Yeah, I think that's been my lifelong understanding of things.
Like I tend to be a fan of the Enlightenment values, but several times in there, you're like, there's no going back to the Enlightenment values, But is it kind of like how you're saying, I don't have a roadmap forward, but I have some principles that can we still incorporate some like the principles of open discussion, open inquiry that came out of the Enlightenment value? Can we still, can we advocate for those principles? Like maybe we don't go back to the formation of Canada, but we can still take some of those principles that seem to help us thrive and bring them forward with us?
I think I'm a political liberal in that sense.
Okay, yeah.
Not a big L liberal, but I certainly.
Yeah.
But if you speak of Enlightenment values, then you're also speaking of things that have past their best before date. I think that we are in new circumstances.
Yeah.
And radically new circumstances, and circumstances that are very difficult to think. And so, yeah.
That's maybe creating spaces to think is one of the first tasks.
It's not a captivating political slogan. Let's stop and think.
Well, I like it. Hey, I think that's a winner, actually.
but I mean, yes, that is what I believe.
That's one of the better political slogans I've heard in a while, actually.
You can sort of imagine the orator, right?
I do also like your pushback against objectivity in media. Like you're not pushing back against the concept of objectivity in the sciences or in academia. You're kind of saying that's kind of where it belongs, and we should maybe remove the word objectivity from replace it with something like fairness or open-mindedness or something like that.
Well, that's what I would say. But I think objectivity fundamentally is the language of subjects and objects.
Yeah.
And the subject is capable of standing apart from the object and conceives him or herself as separate and distinct from the object.
Mm-hmm.
But that may not be the case. And it's certainly an ideology, objectivity, invented in the early 20th century by at the time of media consolidation, the mass circulation newspaper. Objectivity was an ideology because you can't possibly comprehend the world in a bunch of news segments, right? I'll give you an example. This morning I read a Jewish group has this was only reported in the National Post, has released a study of the CBC's news coverage of the Israel-Gaza events, and come to the conclusion that the CBC is biased, severely biased against Israel. That's systematic. That's, they say, structural. But reading their report, I could easily, between the lines, see that they're actually talking about the news gathering process and its eventualities, right? So after a while, they seem to forget about the hostages that were in Gaza. That's one of the pieces of evidence. Well, yeah, because Gaza was being bombed, and that's what they could see, and that's what they were following. And, there are other a great deal of how news is done has to do with the conditions under which news is produced and the forces governing how it can be produced and distributed. So I think when you reach the degree of media saturation that we have now reached, you're at a kind of apocalypse, right? If you can take the original meaning of apocalypse, which is revelation, right? Something goes and goes and goes and goes, and finally you think, well, that's what this was, right? and I think we're at that apocalyptic moment, in the question of media. And that's why I dare to preach sermons to the CBC about saying, you need to rethink this now, right? You can't retrench on objective news because you can't produce objective news.
No.
That's regardless of whether you ever could, which is an interesting discussion. But I think currently you cannot.
Yeah.
And therefore you need to think, well, all the virtues that went under the name of objectivity are real and good and permanent virtues, right? You absolutely want fairness. You absolutely want as disinterested an investigator as it's possible to have, right? Mm-hmm. And all those, so the character of the people producing the news is as relevant as ever. But it just doesn't, to claim objectivity is to locate it within a mythical past. And I don't think that's where we're going. So I think you need to rethink that, right? And be more honest about, I don't know what the CBC thinks, right? Locally in Toronto, we get way more crime news than we used to. I guess that's what they think is good, right? But, anyway, I won't go on about that.
Yeah, I find the objectivity collapse. I just see on both sides of the spectrum all the time. I'll read pieces that are just straight up hit pieces on people. They're smear campaigns or just real bias takes, but then it'll be like fact checked by, because they, fact checked the date a march happened on or the location or something. But the rest of the article was just, and so it's like, I think we'd be better off just discarding that word.
Yeah, I think a whole lot of things came to fruition, maturity, full expression during the pandemic. And one of them was trusted news, which the slogan was put in play by the BBC in 2019. Just before the pandemic, they started the Trusted News Initiative, right? But this led to all, people abuse the word misinformation, disinformation now. It just basically means something I don't agree with, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's a red herring, right? I think it doesn't mean there aren't people who are spreading fantastical ideas. There are people who are spreading fantastical ideas, and there are probably people within the reach of our voices who think that Bill Gates has two heads and maybe cloven hoofs, But generally speaking, I think it covers up disagreements, right?
Yeah.
Different orientations. People assemble the story, the supporting story, around some narrative or mythic kernel, and that's more primary, right? Yeah. And if you feel your story is scorned, you'll probably gather more and more fantastical facts in support of it. I can see that dynamic works, all right. But I think respect for one another's stories and voices is primary. Not trying to create some sort of information police who will say, that this is certified, that's not certified. Right?
Right. As we wrap up here, I just want to kind of put things in a bit of a nutshell, because I guess you are making a bit of a nuanced argument here, where we're in an era where everybody has a phone and can be their own broadcaster. You're arguing for a certain amount of, is this accurate? A certain amount of elitism should always remain at the CBC, a certain amount of, because we need experts and expertise. And so are you arguing for a bit of responsible elitism, where the elites are curating multiple publics in order for essentially, you know what I mean? Yeah. They're because you don't want just everybody's views expressed and just everybody yelling at everybody. You want the proper experts from a variety of publics or representatives or voices from different publics all being represented but you need someone curating that.
I think so. I think
Okay.
so. I would rather speak of wisdom than of expertise.
Wisdom tradition. Yeah.
I'd rather speak of character and virtue than of expertise. But yes, I don't think you can have a good society without exemplary people who lead and form their fellow citizens and not just serve them, right?
Yes,
so I don't know what's going to come out of this maelstrom, and it may be nothing good. But if the CBC, if I'm right that the CBC has had the approach, the ideology I call populism, right? If I'm right that it has run its course, right? That it can no longer guide the corporation into a central position in Canadian life, then yes, something new has to emerge, and I think it will have to be led, and it will have to lead. Mm-hmm. But it's very difficult to talk about it because the terms, in a way, are all problematic, right? And that brings me back around to what I've been trying to say all along. What I'm trying to say in the book is, when your language is shot, you need to draw back and first understand what you mean, to understand what you're saying when you open your mouth, right? It isn't, I mean, there's a whole long section in the book about language and about ready-made languages, and the extent to which the CBC needs to question those languages rather than just adopting them, passing them through, passing them on, right? So a degree of self-consciousness, a degree of adventurousness, these are not easy things to speak about, right? They don't have a formula. They don't, I have so far been very sad that this book doesn't seem to have penetrated the CBC at all, with one beautiful exception. An old friend of mine down east did a featured interview, but other than that, it has not been discussed or taken up. And the people who have taken it up, by and large, are people who are hostile to the CBC. And, you know, they found parts of my argument that agree with their argument. So then you know, I can go on the front page of the National Post. But that's not where I hoped to be discussed. Nothing against the National Post. But I really hope that people at the CBC would begin to think about these things, right? It has no programmatic implications. There's no way a new head of the CBC you could say, okay, Jared, you're going to be in charge of the CBC. And you can then say, okay, boys, girls, this is what we're going to do. No, it doesn't. That's not what I'm saying at all. And one of the stories I tell in the book is the strange twists of history is Patrick Watson, who was the host of This Hour Has 7 Days in his second season, finally becoming the president of the CBC and being completely unable to do anything that he had hoped to do because he was in a situation that was effectively predetermined against him. You know, this is my conceit is that thinking comes first.
Yeah. I like
but
it.
then I was an ideas producer for 30 years.
Well, you're the exact type of person we need to be listening to right now. So I appreciate the book. And I imagine it's being passed in a brown paper bag among CBC employees right now.
Maybe that's why I don't know about it.
Yeah, that's why you probably don't know about it.
I like that. Thank you.
Well, as we wrap up here, David, is there anywhere people can find your works where if they want to pursue?
Well, I have
thoughts?
a website, which is just davidcayley.com. So if you can spell my name, you can find it. And I post quite a lot of writing there, things that aren't maybe yet ready for prime time, you will find there. And all my old broadcasts are there. For those who want to go back and explore. And that's one of the glories of the internet, in my opinion, right? All this work that seemed to be ephemeral. At the time it was broadcast, it can be preserved.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, let's just say thank you again, David, and we really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.